Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading The Amityville Horror by J. Anson. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back and relax, and enjoy the story. This week, we're starting on Chapter 11. This takes place from December 29th to the 30th. The next morning, Monday, George's ankle was stiff. He had taken a nasty tumble over the porcelain lion and fallen heavily against some of the logs by the fireplace. He also had a cut over his right eye, but it hadn't bled much after Kathy put a Band-Aid on it. What disturbed Kathy was the clear imprint of teeth marks on his ankle. George limped out to his 1974 Ford van and had trouble turning over the cold motor. With temperatures in the low 20s, George knew he could anticipate ignition problems, but finally he got the van going and headed across the island towards Syosset. His first order of business was to cover the check he had written to the Astoria Manor. This meant drawing funds from the account of William H. Perry, his land surveying company. Halfway to Syosset, on the Sunrise Highway, George felt a bump in the back of the van. He pulled over and inspected the rear end. One of the shock absorbers had come loose and had fallen off. George was puzzled. This was a mishap that might occur after the shocks were old and worn, if then, but the Ford had gone only 26,000 miles. He drove on again, intending to replace the part once he returned to Amityville. After George drove off that morning, Kathy's mother called to tell her that she had received a card from Jimmy and Carrie in Bermuda. "Why don't you bring the children over to my house for a while?" Jimmy's car was still in the driveway, but Kathy didn't feel like leaving home. She said she still had a load of laundry to do, but that she and George might come over New Year's Eve. They had made no plans as yet, and she would ask George when he came back. Kathy hung up and looked around, feeling at a loss as to what she should do next. The depressed feeling from the day before was still with her, and she was afraid to remain alone in the kitchen or go down to the washing machines in the basement. After the ceramic lion incident, Kathy also hesitated about going into the living room. She finally wound up going upstairs to be near the children. With them, she thought, she wouldn't feel so alone and frightened. Kathy looked in on Missy in her bedroom and Danny and Chris in theirs before going into her own room and lying down. She had been on the bed, dozing, for about 15 minutes when she began to hear noises coming from the sewing room across the hall. It sounded as if someone was opening and closing a window. Kathy got off the bed and went to the sewing room door. It was still shut. She could see that Missy was in her own bedroom, and she could hear the boys running around on the floor above. She listened. Behind the closed door, the sounds continued. Kathy stared at the door, but did not dare open it. She turned around and went back to her bedroom and got back on the bed, pulling the covers up over her head. In Syosset, George found a caller waiting for him. The man introduced himself as an inspector from the Internal Revenue Service and explained he was there to examine the company's books and past tax returns. George called his accountant. The IRS agent spoke with him and made an appointment to return on January 7th. After the agent left, George got on with his priorities, withdrawing $500 from the William H. Perry account and depositing it in his personal checking account, going over plans that had been completed for several land surveys, deciding how to handle the few assignments that had come into the office since he had been away, and then doing some research into the DeFeo family and the background of 112 Ocean Avenue. When the men on his staff asked him why he'd been out so long, George told them only that he had been sick. He knew that was untrue, but what other explanation would make any sense? By 1 o'clock, George had completed his duties in Syosset. He planned to make one more stop before heading back to Amityville. Long Island's largest daily newspaper, in pages of advertising and circulation, is Newsday. George reasoned that if there was any place where he could learn some facts about the DeFeos, Newsday's Garden City office would be the most logical starting point. He was referred to the microfilm department, where a clerk checked the cross-index files for the dates of the DeFeo murders and Ronnie's trial. George only vaguely recalled the details of the way the son had slaughtered the whole family, but he did remember that the trial had been held in Riverhead, Long Island, sometime in the fall of 1975. George put the microfilm of the newspaper into the reader and ran it down until he came to November 14th, 1974. One of the first items he noticed was a photograph taken of Ronnie DeFeo at the time of his arrest, the morning after the discovery of the family's bodies at 112 Ocean Avenue. The bearded 24-year-old face staring back at him from the picture could have been his own. He was about to read on when it hit George that this was the face he had seen fleetingly on the closet wall in his basement. The first articles told how Ronnie had run into a bar near his home, calling for help, saying that someone had killed his parents, brothers, and sisters. With two friends, Ronald DeFeo returned to his house, where they found Ronald Sr., 43, Louise, 42, Allison, 13, Dawn, 18, Mark, 11, and John, 9. All were in their beds, all shot in the back. The story continued that at the time of the DeFeo's arrest the following morning, Amityville police said that the motives for the murders were a $200,000 life insurance policy and a strongbox filled with cash hidden in his parents' bedroom closet. The last item explained that when the prosecution was ready, the trial would be held in the state Supreme Court at Riverhead. George inserted another microfilm reel, this one containing the day-by-day record of the 7-week trial held from September through November. The record included charges of police brutality, enforcing a confession from Ronnie DeFeo, and went on to attorney William Weber's parading psychiatrists to the stand to substantiate his plea of Ronnie's insanity. However, the jury found the youth sane and guilty of murder, imposing a sentence of 6 consecutive life terms. State Supreme Court Justice Thomas Salk called the killings the most heinous and abhorrent crimes. George left the Newsday offices thinking of the coroner's report that pinpointed the time of the DeFeo's deaths at about 3:15 in the morning. That was the exact moment George had been waking since they'd been in the house. He would have to tell Kathy. George also wondered if the DeFeos had used the red room in the basement as a secret hideaway for their money. As he drove back to Amityville, George was so absorbed in thought that he never noticed or heard his left tire wobbling. As he stopped for a red light on Route 110, another car pulled alongside. The driver leaned over and opened his window on the right side. He tooted his horn to catch George's attention, then yelled that George's wheel was coming off. George got out and examined the wheel. All the bolts were loose. George could feel them turn easily in his fingers. With his windows closed, he had dimly heard the racket, but being wrapped up in his own thoughts, he just never considered it was coming from his car. What the devil was going on? First the shock absorber had fallen off, now this. Was someone fooling around with the van? He or Kathy could be killed if the wheel came off while driving at any speed. George became even angrier and more frustrated when he looked for the jack handle in the rear of the van. It was gone. He'd have to tighten the bolts by hand until he could get to a service station. By then it would be too late to do any further checking on the background of 112 Ocean Avenue. On Tuesday, Father Mancuso could no longer ignore the red splotches in the palms of his hands, nor the excruciating pain he felt when he touched the sore spots. Even though the doctor had given him antibiotic injections, he had been unable to shake off this second flu attack. His temperature remained high, and every ache and pain in his body seemed intensified and magnified 100-fold. The day before, Monday, Father Mancuso had accepted the redness that developed in his palms as just another manifestation of his illness. When the peculiar coloring and extreme sensitivity remained, and it became painful to pick up anything with his hands, Father Mancuso started to become a great deal more concerned. The next day, the Amityville Historical Society had some interesting information for George, particularly about the very location of his house. It seems the Shinnecock Indians used land on the Amityville River as an enclosure for the sick, mad, and dying. These unfortunates were penned up until they died of exposure. However, the record noted that the Shinnecocks did not use this tract as a consecrated burial mound because they believed it to be infested with demons. For how many uncounted centuries the Shinnecocks carried on in this manner, no one really knows, but in the late 1600s, white settlers eased the first Americans out of the area, sending them farther out on Long Island. To this day, Shinnecocks still own land, property, and businesses on the eastern tip of the island. One of the more notorious settlers who came to the newly named Amityville in those days was a John Ketchum, who had been forced out of Salem, Massachusetts, for practicing witchcraft. John set up residence within 500 feet of where George now lived, continuing his alleged devil worship. The account also claimed he was buried somewhere on the northeast corner of the property. From the real estate tax assessment office in town, George learned that the house at 112 Ocean Avenue had been built in 1928 by a Mr. Monahan. It passed through several families until 1965, when the DeFeos purchased it from the Rileys. But in spite of all he had read in the past 2 days, George was no closer to a solution of what the mysterious red room was supposed to be for, or who built it. There was no record of any improvements being made to the house that resembled the addition of a basement room. It was the night before New Year's Eve. The Lutzes went to bed early. George had checked the sewing room for Kathy, as he had done the night before after returning from Newsday. Both evenings the windows had been shut and locked. Earlier they had discussed what George had discovered about the history of their property and house. "George," Kathy asked nervously, "do you think it's haunted?" "No way," he replied. "I don't believe in ghosts. Besides, everything that's happened around here must have a logical and scientific explanation to it." "I'm not so sure, honey. What about the lion?" "What about it?" he asked. Kathy looked around the kitchen where they were sitting. "Well, what about what I felt those 2 times? I told you I know somebody touched me, George." George stood up, stretching. "Oh, come on, honey. I think it's just your imagination." He reached for her hand. "I've had that happen to me, too, when I was sure my father had put his hand on my shoulder in the office." He pulled Kathy out of her chair. "I was positive he was standing right beside me. It happens to a lot of people, but it's, I think they call it clairvoyance or something like that." The couple had their arms around each other's waists as George turned out the light in the kitchen. They passed the living room on the way to the stairs. Kathy stopped. She could see the crouching lion in the darkness of the room. "George, I think we should continue with our meditation. Let's do it tomorrow, okay? You think that way we can find a logical explanation for all that's happened?" he asked, drawing her upstairs. There was no logical or scientific explanation for Father Frank Mancuso as he prepared to go to bed. He had just prayed at his own altar in his room, searching and hoping for an answer to the reason his palms were beginning to bleed. Chapter 12. December 31st. The year 1976 was just around the corner. The last day of the old year dawned on a heavy snowfall, and to many people that was the signal that a fresh, clean start would usher in the new year. In the Lutz household, there was a completely different mood. George hadn't slept well, even though he had been active enough for the past 2 days, inside and outside the house. He awoke during the night, looked at his watch, and was surprised to find it was 2:30 a.m., not 3:15, as he anticipated. George awoke again at 4:30 a.m., saw it was just beginning to snow, and tried to fall back to sleep under the warm covers. But, tossing and turning, he couldn't find a comfortable position. In her sleep, Kathy was bothered by his restlessness and rolled over against George so that he was pushed to the edge of the bed. Wide awake, he kept having visions of discovering secret caches of money around the house and using them to solve all his financial problems. George was beginning to choke with the pressures of mounting bills for the house he had just taken on and for the office, where he would shortly have a very serious payroll deficit. All the cash that he and Kathy had saved had gone towards the expense of the closing, an old fuel bill, and paying off the boats and motorcycles. And now the latest blow, the investigation of his books and tax returns by the Internal Revenue Service. Small wonder that George dreamed of a simple, magical solution to the bind he was in. He wished he could find Jimmy's money. The $1,500 would be a lifesaver. George stared at the falling snow. He had read in the newspaper account that Mr. DeFeo had been extremely well off, with a big bank account and with a very good position, working for his wife's father in a big car dealership. George had examined his bedroom closet and discovered Mr. DeFeo's secret hiding place under the door jamb. The police had found it first at the time of Ronnie's arrest, and now it was empty, just a hole in the floor. He kept wondering where else the DeFeos could have stashed away some of their cash. The boathouse! George sat up in bed. Maybe there was a meaning behind his being drawn there every night. Was something dragging him there? Was the dead man somehow urging him to look in there for his fortune? George was desperate, he knew, even to contemplate such a screwy idea. But why else would he be driven to go to the boathouse night after night? At 6:30, George finally gave up and got out of bed. He knew he would never fall asleep again that morning, so he quietly slipped from the room, went down to the kitchen, and made some coffee. It was still dark outside at that hour, but he could see the snow was beginning to pile up near the kitchen door. He saw a light on the ground floor of his neighbor. Maybe the owner also had money problems and couldn't sleep, he thought. George knew he wouldn't go to the office that day. It was New Year's Eve, and everybody would be leaving early anyway. He drank his coffee and planned to search the boathouse and basement for some clues. Then George began to feel a chill in the house. The thermostat automatically dropped the temperature between midnight and 6 in the morning, but now it was almost 7, and the heat didn't seem to be on. George went into the living room and put some kindling and paper into the fireplace. Before the wood blazed up, George noticed that the brick wall was black from all the soot accumulated from his almost constant fires. A little after 8, Kathy came down with Missy. The little girl had awakened her mother with delighted squeals. "Oh, Mama, look at all the snow! Isn't it beautiful? I want to go outside and play with my sled today." Kathy made her daughter breakfast, but couldn't eat anything herself. She had coffee and a cigarette. George didn't want any food and took only another cup of coffee. He had to get it from the kitchen himself because Kathy didn't want to come into the living room. She told George she had a bad headache. Kathy was frightened of the porcelain lion and planned to get rid of it before the day was out, but it was true that she did have a sick headache. By 9 o'clock, George had built the living room fire to a roaring blaze. At 10 o'clock, the snow was still falling. Kathy called out to George from the kitchen that a local radio station had predicted the Amityville River would be completely frozen by nightfall. Reluctantly, George got up from his chair by the fireplace and dressed, put on his boots, and went out to the boathouse. He hadn't had the money to take the cabin cruiser out of the water for the winter. If the river froze, ice would eventually crush the boat, but he had prepared for just this kind of emergency. George's mother had given him her paint compressor, and he had drilled holes in its plastic hose. Now he sank the hose in the water beside the boat and turned on the compressor. It acted as a bubbler system that would keep the water inside the boathouse from freezing. All that morning, Father Mancuso had been looking at his hands. His palms, which had begun to bleed the night before, were now dry, but angry red blisters remained. His fever also held at a high of 103 degrees. When the pastor had looked in on him, Father Mancuso had promised to remain in bed for the rest of the day. The priest did not mention what had been happening to his hands. He kept them in the pockets of his bathrobe the entire time the pastor remained in his rooms. Father Mancuso thought about the stigmata, the marks resembling the wounds of the crucified body of Christ, said to be supernaturally impressed on the bodies of holy people. He stared at the ugly manifestation and became angry. The priest was prepared to give of himself in any way that God demanded. But if he was to suffer in that way, he thought, at least let it be to help humanity. With all his training, experience, devotion, and skill as a judge and psychotherapist, certainly he shouldn't have to settle for something as inconsequential as a house in Amityville. Along with his anger, the pains in his palms increased. He decided to pray for relief, and as Father Mancuso asked for help, his concentration on his misfortune decreased. The numbness in his tightly gripped hands slowly diminished in its pressure. He spread his fingers and stared at the blisters. The priest sighed and knelt at his private altar to thank God. Later in the afternoon was the second time Danny and Chris threatened to run away from home. The first had been when they lived in George's house at Deer Park. He had restricted them to their room for a week because they were lying to him and Kathy about small things. They had revolted against his authority. Both boys refused to obey his orders, threatening to run away if he also forced them to give up television. At that point, George called their bluff, telling Danny and Chris that they could get out if they didn't like the way he ran things at home. The two youngsters had taken him at his word. They packed all their belongings, toys, clothes, records, and magazines, into bedrolls and dragged the big bundles out the front door. When they were about halfway down the street, desperately trying to move the heavy load, a neighbor spotted them and talked them both into going back. For a while they stopped their childish fibbing, but now there had come a new eruption. When she heard them fighting, Kathy had gone up to their room and found the two boys on one of the beds. Chris was straddling Danny's chest, ready to clobber his older brother. On the other bed sat Missy, a broad grin on her little face. She was clapping her hands with excitement. Kathy pulled her sons apart. "What do you think you're doing?" she screamed. "What's the matter with you two? Are you going crazy?" Missy chimed in. "Danny didn't want to clean up the room like you told him to." Kathy looked sternly at the boy. "And why not, young man? Do you see what this room looks like?" The room was a mess. Toys were scattered all over the floor, intermingled with discarded clothes. The tubes of an oil paint set had been left uncapped, the pigments oozing onto the furniture and rug. Some of their new Christmas toys had already been broken and were discarded in corners of the bedroom. Kathy shook her head. "I don't know what I'm going to do with you. We bought this beautiful house so you'd have your own playroom, and look what you've done." Danny tore himself loose from his mother's grip. "You don't want us to stay in that dumb old playroom?" "Yeah," Chris chimed in. "We don't like it around here. There's nobody to play with." Kathy and the boys bickered back and forth for another 5 minutes until Danny threw down the gauntlet and challenged his mother with the threat of running away from home. Kathy, in turn, suggested corporal punishment for their behavior. "And you know who dishes it out around here." By dinner time, the Lutz family had settled down. The boys had cooled off, though Kathy could still feel an undercurrent of tension at the table. George had told Kathy he preferred staying home this New Year's Eve rather than facing drunks on the road home from her mother's house. They had made no plans to be with their friends, and it was too cold to go out to a movie. After they had eaten, Kathy convinced George to move the ceramic lion back up to the sewing room. Again, there were some flies clinging to the window pane facing the Amityville River. George angrily swatted them to death before slamming the door shut. By 10 o'clock, Missy had fallen asleep on the living room floor. She had exacted a promise from Kathy to awaken her at midnight in time to blow her party horn. Danny and Chris were still up, playing near the Christmas tree and watching television. George was attending to his fire. Kathy sat across from him, trying to lose her depression by looking at an old movie with the boys. As the night wore on, Father Mancuso's hands had been acting up again. Now the blisters were worse, breaking out on the backs of his hands. He couldn't put up with the thought of spending the entire night in pain and fright. When his doctor looked in on him, he suddenly shoved his palms out and said, "Look!" Gently, the physician examined the blisters. "Frank, I'm not a dermatologist," he said. "This could be anything from an allergy to an attack of anxiety. Has something been bothering you that badly?" Father Mancuso turned sadly away from the doctor, his eyes staring out the window at the snow. "I think so. Something—" The priest brought his gaze back to the doctor. "Or somebody." The doctor gave the priest some antibiotic capsules and assured him he'd have relief by the morning. Then he left for a party. On television, Guy Lombardo saluted the New Year from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The Lutzes watched the ball fall from the Allied Chemical Building in Times Square, but did not share the countdown with announcer Ben Grauer while he told off the last 10 seconds of 1975. Danny and Chris had gone up to their room about a half an hour earlier, their eyes red from too much television and the smoke from George's fire. Kathy had put Missy into her bed and then came back downstairs to her chair across from George. It was now exactly 1 minute after 12. She stared into the fireplace, hypnotized by the dancing flames. Something was materializing in those flames, a white outline against the blackened bricks, becoming clearer, more distinct. Kathy tried to open her mouth to say something to her husband, but she couldn't. She couldn't even tear her eyes away from the demon with horns and a white peaked hood on its head. It was getting larger, looming towards her. She saw that half of its face was blown away, as if hit with a shotgun blast at close range. Kathy screamed. George looked up. "What's the matter?" he said. All Kathy could do was to point at the fireplace. George followed her gaze, and he saw it too, a white figure that had burned itself into the soot against the rear bricks of the fireplace. Chapter 13. January 1st, 1976. George and Kathy finally went to bed at 1 in the morning. They had been sleeping for what later seemed to them no more than 5 minutes when they were awakened by a howling wind roaring through their bedroom. The blankets on the bed had been virtually torn from their bodies, leaving George and Kathy shivering. All the windows in the room were wide open, and the bedroom door, caught by the drafts, was swinging back and forth. George leaped from the bed and ran to close the windows. Kathy gathered the blankets off the floor and threw them back onto the bed. Both were breathless from their sudden awakening, and even though the door to the room had slammed shut, they could still hear the wind blowing out in the second-floor hallway. George wrenched open the door and was hit by another cold blast. Flipping on the light switch in the hall, he was startled to see the doors to the sewing room and dressing room wide open, the gale rushing freely through the open windows. Only the door to Missy's bedroom remained shut. He ran into the dressing room first, fighting against the gale that hit him, and managed to force the windows down. Then he went to the sewing room and, with the cold now bringing tears to his eyes, closed one window. But George could not budge the open window that faced the Amityville River. He banged furiously on its frame with his fists. Finally it gave and slid to a close. He stood there trying to catch his breath, shaking in his pajamas. The wind was no longer blowing through the house, but he could hear it gusting violently outside. The chill remained. George took one more look around the room before he remembered Kathy. "Honey," he called out, "you all right?" When Kathy followed her husband out into the hallway, she too had seen the open doors, and that Missy's door remained shut. Her heart thumping, Kathy had run to her daughter's room and burst through the doorway. She turned on the light. The room was warm, almost hot. The windows were shut and locked, and the little girl was fast asleep in her bed. But there was something moving in the room. Then she saw it was Missy's chair beside the window, slowly rocking back and forth. Then she heard George's voice. "Honey, you all right?" George came into the bedroom. The heat struck him. It was like stepping in front of a fire. George took it all in at once. The little girl safely asleep, his wife standing at the side of Missy's bed, the incredulous look of fright on Kathy's face, and the small chair teetering back and forth. He took one step towards the rocking chair, and it immediately ceased its movements. George stopped in his tracks, stood absolutely still, and motioned to Kathy. "Take her downstairs. Hurry." Kathy didn't question George. She lifted the little girl off the bed, blankets and all, and hurried from the room. George came out right behind them and slammed the door, not even bothering to turn off the light. Kathy went carefully down the steps towards the first floor. It was ice cold in the hallway. George ran up the staircase to the top floor where Danny and Chris were sleeping. When he came back down from the third floor a few minutes later, he saw Kathy sitting in the dark living room. She held Missy in her arms, the little girl still fast asleep on her lap. He turned on the light in the room, the chandelier casting shadows into the corners. Kathy turned from the fireplace to look up at George questioningly. "They're all right," he nodded. "They're both sleeping. It's cold up there, but they're okay." Kathy let out her breath. He saw its vapor hang in the cold air. George hurriedly started a fire. His fingers were numb, and he suddenly realized that he was barefoot and hadn't thrown anything on over his pajamas. George finally got a small blaze going with newspaper, then fanned the flame with his hand until some of the old kindling caught fire. Crouched in front of the fireplace, he could hear the winds howling outside. Then he turned and looked at Kathy over his shoulder. "What time is it?" That was the only thing he could think of to say, George Lutz recalls. He remembers the look on Kathy's face when he asked the question. She stared at him for a moment, then replied, "I think it's about..." But before Kathy could finish, she burst into tears, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. She rocked Missy back and forth in her arms, sobbing, "Oh, George, I'm frightened to death." George stood up and walked over to his wife and daughter. He crouched down in front of the chair and put his arms around both. "Don't cry, honey," he whispered. "I'm here. Nobody's going to hurt you or the baby." The three remained in that position for some time. Slowly the fire burned brighter, and the room began to warm up. It seemed to George that the winds were diminishing outside. Then he heard the oil burner click on in the basement, and he knew it was exactly 6 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day. By 9 a.m., the temperature in 112 Ocean Avenue had risen to the thermostat-controlled 75 degrees. The icy chill in the house had dissipated. George had made an inspection tour of each window from the first floor to the third. There was no visible evidence that anyone had tampered with the locks on the windows of the second floor, and George remained completely baffled as to how such a bizarre event could have taken place. Looking back at the episode, he claims that at the time, he and Kathy couldn't think of any reason for the windows behaving the way they did, except for a freak of nature, that the hurricane-strength winds had somehow forced the windows up, but he can't answer why it happened only to the second-floor windows and not to any others in the house. Suddenly George felt an urge to go to his office. It was a holiday, no one would be in, but he felt compelled to check on his company's operations. William H. Perry, Inc., had 4 crews of engineers and surveyors in the field. The company had created the plans and blueprints for the largest building complex to date in New York City and for the Glen Oaks Towers in Glen Oaks, Long Island, and was also responsible for planning a 40-block urban renewal project in Jamaica, Queens. In addition, there were several small surveys for title companies. The coordination for setting up each day's work was quite intricate, and for the past few weeks, George had been leaving that assignment to one of his draftsmen, an experienced employee who had worked for his father and grandfather. Over the past year, after he had taken full control of the company from his mother, George's main concern had been with collecting from the city and construction companies that used his services. The company's payroll and expenses were much larger than they had been when George's father was alive. There was also the matter of paying off 6 cars and new field equipment. George realized he had been slacking off. At 10 in the morning, Father Mancuso was also awake. He hadn't slept much and had got up several times during the night to soak his blistered hands in burro solution, as the doctor had recommended. The priest had been out of bed since 7, even though he felt awful from the flu and did feel better when he was laying down. The medication had relieved some of the discomfort and itching in his palms, but the prescription for his flu had no effect on his high fever. In an effort to concentrate on other things besides his mysterious affliction, Father Mancuso tried reading some of his medical journals, searching for articles on psychotherapy. In the 3 hours he had been out of bed, the priest had found over a dozen new and interesting items in this field. Then he noticed a reddish stain on the last magazine he had held. The priest turned over his hands. The palms were smeared with blood. The blisters were bleeding. By noontime, George was in Syosset, working with his adding machine. He had discovered that the money that was coming in didn't balance with what was going out. The accounts payable column was becoming too one-sided lately, and he knew he would have to cut back on his field crews and office personnel. George hated the idea of depriving men of their livelihood, particularly when he knew they'd have a hard time finding other jobs in the suffering construction industry. But it had to be done, and he wondered where to begin. George didn't dwell too long on the subject, however, because he had other pressing problems. Before the banking week was up the next day, Friday, he would again have to transfer funds from one company bank account to another to cover checks that had been issued to suppliers. Deeply involved in these manipulations, George didn't notice the passing time. For the first moment since December 18th, George Lutz was not thinking about himself or 112 Ocean Avenue. But his wife was thinking very hard about the house. Kathy hadn't told George in so many words, but she was becoming convinced that some of the events in the past 2 weeks had been the work of outside forces. She was sure he would think her conclusions silly, and she had been too embarrassed to tell George of her encounter with the ceramic lion. She now feels that she had become aware that the little bits and pieces were adding up even before George had. She was frightened and wanted to talk to someone. She thought of her mother, but quickly dismissed the idea. Joan Connors was very religious and would insist that Kathy immediately talk to her old parish priest. Kathy wasn't quite ready to enter into a world of ghosts and demons. She wanted the discussion to remain on a more general level at first. In her heart, however, she knew perfectly well where the subject would eventually lead. She went into the kitchen and dialed the phone number of the one person who would understand what she was looking for, Father Mancuso. She heard the connection go through and the first ring on the other end. As Kathy waited for the second ring, she suddenly became aware that the kitchen was pervaded by a sweet odor of perfume. Her flesh crawled as she waited for the familiar touch on her body. Father Mancuso's number rang again, but Kathy never heard it. She had hung up the telephone and run from the room. In the rectory, Father Mancuso had been bathing his hands in the solution and found that the bleeding in his palms had stopped. The priest had a towel in his hands when the telephone rang in his living room. He picked up the telephone after the second ring. When he said, "Hello," the line was disconnected. He looked at the instrument. Well, what was that all about? Then Father Mancuso thought of George Lutz and shook his head. "Oh, no, I'm not going through that business again." He put down the receiver and went back into the bathroom. The priest looked at his blisters. Disgusting, he thought. Then he looked up at his face in the mirror. "When will this end?" he said to his reflection. His illness certainly showed. The circles under his eyes were darker, and there was an unhealthy pallor to his skin. Father Mancuso gingerly felt his beard. It needed a trimming, but the hand would never be steady enough to hold a pair of scissors. Father Mancuso says that staring at his reflection in the mirror suddenly made him think of the subject of demonology. The priest was aware of the scope of the field and the various occult phenomena its study embraces. He had never liked the subject, not even when he was taking the course in his student days at the seminary, and he had never tried to become too knowledgeable. Father Mancuso knows of other priests who have concentrated on demonology, but he's never met an exorcist. Every priest is empowered to perform the rites of exorcism, but the Catholic Church prefers that this dangerous ceremony be restricted to those clerics who have become specialists in dealing with obsession and possession. Father Mancuso had kept looking into his own eyes in the bathroom mirror, but found no answers to his dilemma. He felt it was time he confided in his friend, the pastor of the Sacred Heart Rectory. The morning snowfall had made traveling on the roads hazardous. As the day wore on, it got colder, and cars began to get caught in drifts and skid on icy spots all over Long Island. But the snow had stopped falling while George was driving back to Amityville from his office, and he made it home all right. The driveway of 112 Ocean Avenue was heavy with fresh snow. George saw he would have to clear a path to the garage before moving the van into the driveway. "I'll do it tomorrow," he thought, and left the vehicle parked on the street, which had been recently plowed by the city's snow trucks. He noted that Danny and Chris had been out playing in the snow. Their sleds were parked up against the steps leading to the kitchen door. As he stepped inside, he saw that they had left a trail of melting, snowy footprints through the kitchen and up the staircase. Kathy must be upstairs, he thought. If she'd seen the slush they'd tracked into her clean house, there would have been hell to pay. George found his wife in their bedroom, lying on the bed, reading to Missy from one of the little girl's new Christmas storybooks. Missy was gleefully clapping her hands. "Hi, gang," he said. His wife and daughter looked up. "Daddy!" they chorused together, leaping off the bed and encircling George with delight. For the first time in what seemed ages to Kathy, the Lutz family had a happy supper together. Unknown to her, Danny and Chris, forewarned by George, had sneaked back down to the kitchen and wiped away all traces of their snowy entry. They sat at the table, their faces still ruddy from hours spent romping in the cold air, and wolfed down the hamburgers and French fries their mother had prepared especially for them. Missy kept the family in smiles with her aimless chatter, and the way she kept sneaking fries off the boys' plates when they weren't looking. When caught, Missy would turn her face towards her accuser and flash a mouthful of teeth, -1, to disarm him. Kathy felt more secure with George home. Her fears had momentarily calmed, and she gave no further thought to the latest whiff of perfume earlier that afternoon. "Maybe I'm getting paranoid about the whole thing," she thought to herself. She looked about the table. The warm atmosphere certainly didn't portend a visit from any more ghosts. As for George, he had let his depressing business operations retreat to the furthest recesses of his mind. It was as though he had entered a little cocoon at 112 Ocean Avenue. This was the way he wanted life to be all the time in his new house. Whatever the world outside had to offer, the Lutzes would tough it out together from their home. He and Kathy shared a steak. Then, lighting a cigarette, George wandered off to the living room with the boys. George had brought Harry into the house to feed him and let him remain in to rough it up with his 2 sons in front of the fireplace. The Lutzes had eaten early, and so it was only a little after 8 when Danny and Chris began to nod. While the boys marched upstairs to bed, followed by Missy and Kathy, George took Harry out to the doghouse. Wading through the snow that had piled up between the kitchen door and the compound, he tied Harry to the strong lead line. Harry crawled into his doghouse, turned around several times until he found his right spot, and then settled down with a little sigh. While George stood there, the dog's eyes closed, and he fell asleep. "That does it," said George. "I'm taking you to the vet on Saturday." After putting Missy to sleep, Kathy returned to the living room. George made his usual tour of the house, now double-checking every window and door. He had already inspected the garage and boathouse doors when he took Harry outside. "Let's see what happens tonight," he told Kathy when he came back down. "It's not blowing at all out there." By 10 p.m., both George and Kathy were feeling drowsy. His blazing fire was running out, but the heat was affecting their eyes. She waited until George had poked out the last embers and had poured water over some still smoldering pieces of wood. Then Kathy turned off the chandelier and looked around to take her husband's hand in the darkness. She screamed. Kathy was looking past George's shoulder at the living room windows. Staring back at her were a pair of unblinking red eyes. At his wife's scream, George whirled around. He also saw the little beady eyes staring directly into his. He jumped for the light switch, and the eyes disappeared in the shining reflection in the glass pane. "Hey!" George shouted. He burst through the front door into the snow outside. The windows of the living room faced the front of the house. It didn't take George more than a second or two to get there, but there was nothing at the windows. "Kathy!" he shouted. "Get my flashlight!" George strained his eyes to see towards the back of the house in the direction of the Amityville River. Kathy came out of the house with his light and his parka. Standing beneath the window where they had seen the eyes, they searched the fresh, unbroken snow. Then the yellow beam of the flashlight picked up a line of footprints, extending clear around the corner of the house. No man or woman had made those tracks. The prints had been left by cloven hooves, like those of an enormous pig. Well, thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of the Amityville Horror. And until then, have a great week, everyone.